Today we will discuss the best theory regarding the thought which is independent of language. The relationship between language and thought is essentially the one that was advocated by John Locke. It is that thought is independent of language. That means that it is separate from language and it is not dependent on language, which means that your ideas are there, they do not require language. That language is dependent on thought, and for communication purposes or for expression, you require language, but language requires thoughts to be conveyed and to be communicated. So according to this hypothesis, they believe that thought is independent of language. The relationship between thought and language can be traced back to 19th century. It has been a subject of immense debate for many years. In 1940s, especially with the introduction of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this particular subject gained a lot of interest and popularity. Now, according to Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, people who speak differently also think differently. And this aspect or this claim has been subject to a lot of criticism, but there has not been a single study or finding which can either refute or accept this hypothesis in its totality. The researchers have come up with the idea so far, which can be considered as valid, that both language and thought, they enjoy interactive relationship. That is, that language does dictate thought, whereas thought also influences the language or the use of language. Now we will discuss the further points in detail with regard to thought and language. So we have 3 points to discuss, and you can see which is number 1 is thought is independent of language. Now the thought system in the mind of the child develops over time as input stimuli of the world, such as visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli, the kind of stimuli which connects to sense of touch, represent objects, events, and situations in the environment, are experienced by the child. Until thought is sufficiently developed, which is ideas of objects, relations of objects, actions of objects, words uttered in the presence of the child are not meaningfully processed. When that happens, and when language input is experienced in coordination with objects, events, and situations, then language can begin to be learned. Over a period of time, the language system, with its vocabulary and grammatical rule, is formed. The development of thought precedes the development of language, which is the second area that needs to be discussed. As thought develops, the child seeks to express these thoughts to others. Through speech understanding, the child develops a grammar and finds a means through speech production to provide meaningful speech. The grammar develops as the result of prior thought. Thus, the sequence is as follows. You have thought, which leads to speech understanding. That leads to speech production. So this is the process. It is with this sequencing of thought, speech understanding and speech production takes place. The last point is the notion of thinking in language, which has been considered a fallacy. That is, it is often observed that sound forms of words come to one's awareness while one is thinking. It is a mistake, however, to conclude that the sound forms themselves are thought. So that is basically a fallacy. Such word forms are merely reflection of some underlying ideas. It is thought that determines the selection of word forms. As children, we learn to encode thoughts into language and then into acoustic speech, because we discover that in order to interact effectively with people, we must be instantly ready to express our thoughts into speech. We consequently develop a habit of converting thoughts into speech at a mental level. It is this mental sound form that we sometimes become aware of when we think. Also, we must note that when a child first learns to speak, it seems that the child does not have suppression control, and that much of what he or she thinks is articulated into speech. What the child must and soon does learn is that while it is all right to automatically convert all thoughts to sentences in the mind, it is not all right to convert all of those sentences to overt speech. Socially unpleasant consequences result from these kinds of utterances. Let's conclude in the word of John Locke. The comfort and advantage of society not being to be had without communication of thought, it was necessary that man should find out some external visible signs whereof those invisible ideas which his thoughts are made up of might be made known to others.